Okay, so we are starting off this week with demos. Uh, do we have a pair that would like to go first?
No.
Okay, whoever is not Dana can.
We can go first, it's fine. Okay, I'll share my screen. Okay. Okay. Okay, so our task this week was to not allow for duplicate items to be added to the database. So we thought we had it, but then we saw Yenli's message, so we'll get that taken care of. So originally, if you add like chorizo and you add the item, you get to add the item, add a notification, and then you see it here. And then if you do it like in uppercase, and add a bunch of special characters, you should get the notification that the item already exists. So that's what we had, but from my understanding from Yenli's message, we shouldn't like even allow for special characters to be in the database in the first place, I think is where we messed up. So if I put like pie, we should not have that showing up in the list, I believe, right, Yenli? So yeah, we'll get that fixed, but yeah, so that's our demo for now.
Before we keep going, I want to make sure there's clarity on the acceptance criteria. So it's not that you shouldn't have special characters. It's more of when you put spaces in between the word. I put hot space, like 3 spaces, cocoa, and it gets like it still ends up being saved. And then on the front end, it prints it as hot cocoa. So that's how I was able to get hot cocoa 3 times on your list by just putting spaces. So I think the comparison and how you're doing, you want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. And the second gift that I had captured was like the list that you're comparing against with your value. You can see the difference as you're going through. So that's a way to debug.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
To clarify on the first thing, should the original item that is entered can have punctuation, and basically it should be saved as typed in. Is that right?
I think so. Let's see. I'm trying to look at the AC again. Yeah, it doesn't really say that you shouldn't. It's just that you don't want to have an existing name again. So if someone wants to type their list in Leet, I guess you can allow it, but you just want to make sure that if they type it again, that it won't get saved.
Okay.
I think I saw something in the original AC that was like you shouldn't do all of your sanitizations before you save it to the database. You should save whatever the user types, but then your sanitizations should just be for when you're comparing the 2 entries. Right, so you don't want to like lowercase everything, strip all of the user's punctuation, strip all the spaces, or whatever the comparison rules are. You don't want to apply those before you save it to the database, because then the user is going to end up with something on their list that doesn't look like what they typed, and that's confusing. Right. So you save it the way they type it, but then when you're doing the future comparisons, you want to make sure that they're following the comparison rules.
Oh, okay. Okay, and then the spacing thing should still be trimmed, right? So then if like the user originally put in like a lot of spacing, we should take that out then, or no?
I don't remember based on what the thing said.
That's a good question.
That might be
Yeah.
that might be a team choice. Like if you want to kind of clean up some known things, but I wouldn't say that removing like exclamation points, for example, would be something you'd want to do.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Cool. Thank you for the demo. And then I don't remember who your partner was, but do they want
It was
to?
me.
You want to
So
go
yeah.
the code?
Yeah, for sure. All right.
So most of our code is taking place within the handle submit function, which connects to the add item view form. And so we start out by preventing the event so the page doesn't refresh. And then we use a query snapshot to get all the existing documents in the collection. And then we have a variable items, which takes in all the item names from the database. And we mutate those using the to lowercase method and a regex to basically whitelist anything that is not a special character or a space. And we compare that to the user's input using the same methods. And if that list of current items matches the user's input, then we display a toast notification telling the user that there is a duplicate item. Otherwise, their input gets added to the database as normal. Sorry, that was really
very
brief.
nice.
Right,
Oh,
what
yeah.
what does that function do? Duplicate?
It was just a toast notification. It's just what we named it.
Oh, okay, I see. Gotcha.
Very
Rocco, what does
cool.
the snapshot do from the database? That just grabs the information that's in there and the code waits for that to come back before it proceeds? Is that how you wrote it? I'm asking because I don't know, not because I'm grilling you.
Oh, no, for sure. Yeah, no, that's basically what it does.
Okay, cool.
So
Because that could be useful to us.
yeah, exactly. So can you use that? How do you find all the values? Do you just do console log the query snapshot to get all the values from the Firestore? Because you made it into a variable.
Can you clarify that a bit? Or
Can you
do you
show
want me to
your
show yeah.
code again? Yeah, it's hard. Yeah. So you get query snapshot, right? 28, right? And then that's how you get all the values, right? In the collection.
Yeah, all the documents within the collection.
Okay, so
that
if
match the token.
oh, so then you did query snapshot docs. Okay, I see.
Mhm.
Okay, I see. I guess
I don't know.
way to do
Oh,
that.
sorry.
I don't know if it would help you guys, but Dana and I originally used that method to get the collection, and then we switched it over to using the hook method. I don't know if you remember, Dana. So I don't know if looking at that
They
old
use
code would help you
collection,
guys. Yeah. So maybe looking at the old way that we did it would help you guys with whatever you're
We
doing.
actually use the old way actually for our code. So
Okay.
it's cool. Like there's two ways to do it. I actually didn't know
Mhm.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, that method might solve for some of the issues when the component's trying to mount, but the check between if there's a value or not, sometimes it hits and sometimes it doesn't. I think the way that you did it would be a more stable way to compare instead of like relying on, hey, did I wait long enough after the toast popped up to like go to the next thing?
Yeah, that's true.
I do want to chime in. I think Tanner was the one who recommended using the hook method because when you're using the hook, you can check to see if it's done loading. And that technique of saving that separately as your list to check against is a good idea. It's more of just making sure that you're doing apples to apples and whatever you define that to be. But it's close, it's looking really good.
All right. So I think Dana and Dev are up.
Do you want to show the code? Or should I show the code, or do you want to present? How should we do this?
Do you want me to bring it up and then we can talk to it together?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'm cool with that.
All right.
Let's see what we can do. Share it and then let's bring it up.
Mhm.
Okay, so I'm gonna refresh the screen. Our issue this week was to join an existing shopping list by entering the 3-word token in an input box and then saving that token to local storage. And then once we have that token, then routing the user to that list that corresponds with the token. So one of the existing tokens is Very Adore Suite. So I'm going to type that in the box and it brings us to the Very Adore Suite list. We added a nav to go back home. And then I also can put a capital letter in so that it'll accept a capitalization. that still works. And then if it is not a valid token, like say I mistyped it, you get a token not valid error. So over here, you can see the token, the last token that was saved in local storage. And then in the code, oops, here we go. We worked together on saving the user's input. So we built the input box. And then when somebody types in the box, we're running the handle change function. So it takes in the event and it sets a value to what they're typing in the box. After that runs, we're setting what the token input is by passing in a helper function. So we're passing the value that is what's typed in the box to the sanitize helper function. And that helper function is just taking in the input. So in this case, the token input, making it lowercase, and then taking the space characters off. But we had a heck of a time with trying to figure out what to compare. And I think one of the things that was challenging for me is English versus code. So I knew what I wanted to do, but when using variable names, it sounded like it was the right variable name, but what I was actually giving the computer instructions to do was different. So it's a good learning to be careful of A, what we call things, and B, that like either I'm logging or debugging to make sure of what I think I'm passing in is the exact thing that I'm passing in. Is it doing what I expect? And a lot of that came down to reading the error message and tracking it back to the line and going, why would I get that error? Okay, that's on line 21. Oh, okay, we're not getting a value here. Why would we not get a value? Well, maybe because the token input, something's wrong with it, or it's not, there's no space, or there's something. So there was a lot of problem solving in regards to error handling. And that's, I think, where it helped being part of a team. And Deb, let me know if that's correct, but I was way faster when we were working together than like when it's the weekend and, you know, we're clocked out, but like we're trying to still problem solve as we can. And, you know, if like in a perfect world, if we had like unlimited time, like I think it would be like the most time efficient and like learning efficient to do everything together, just because two brains are always better than one. And that was like a big learning on pair programming this week, is that like I don't know what I don't know, and I can't see what I'm blind to at the moment. It helps to have a good partner. Thanks, Dev.
Yeah, likewise. I really enjoyed working with you. We were able to like kind of like build off each other, like our strengths and weaknesses. It was good.
I have a question. Can you scroll down to the return at the end, where you have the input field? Okay. Okay. So my question was, the handle change, and then in the handle submit, you have the sanitize function in each of those. And so when I saw it in the handle change, I was surprised because I thought that that would be sanitizing it as you type, basically. Because if you were using token input as the value of that input field below, where you just scrolled to, then, you know, when you set the token input, it would be, you know, saving the sanitized value.
Right.
Did you run into that? And
yeah, for 2 days or more. Yeah, we absolutely did. So that there was a value property here, and it was set equal to the variable of the token input. And so unknowingly, we didn't know that, like, because we had tested it so many times, that we were just like hitting what was like a saved entry in our browser. So we were just like, okay, Vereador suite would pop up and we'd hit the enter. We weren't typing it in at that point. And that's when Yenli and Rafa pointed it out, like, hey, you can't type in this field. Like you can't type a space. And I'm like, what? After that many hours, really? But it's funny that like it didn't take until today that I was like, why is that happening? Like, because we wrote that to happen that way. So I removed it to see what it would do. And I'm like, oh, okay, that could be a solution. Like we could do it that way. I like what Rafa said about putting it in the handle submit because it would be a better place for it. But then I had difficulty with, I couldn't do an if else in the handle submit because then we have to use that value that can't be used with the conditional. It can't be used in hook. So it got weird.
Say that again, the value.
This value here, because we're calling on the database, it's used right here in the handle submit. And so if I wanted to mess around with the token input here in the handle submit function, it was causing errors and bugs in terms of like, it would either be out of scope because I had to like, what was happening is I would set the token input and it would update the token input, but even if I put it right after the event e.prevent default, by the time the code reached here, it wasn't updated.
Right.
So
So
the
you're
value
talking
wasn't
about
updated.
calling set token input inside the handle submit function.
Right.
So what you have is working. What I would say that maybe you can consider for next time is leaving the input value actually controlled. And like you were saying with what Rafa was saying, only sanitizing when you're actually ready to submit it. I usually think of states as a couple of different things. One is like user input, and you almost never touch that because like you said, if you're trimming spaces while they're typing, then they're never going to be able to type a space, right? So you kind of just leave the user input alone. But you might need that to be in state so that it can be a controlled input. That's kind of up to you. But then when you actually go to submit it, I think that what you could do here is just set a constant inside this handle submit function where you say, sanitize token equals sanitize, and then pass the token input to that. And then you can use that value where you're setting it in local storage, where you're setting it in state, and so forth, rather than having to set it when you're actually changing the thing and then not be able to use that value in your form. I don't know if that makes sense. It's kind of hard like to talk about it, just kind of waving my hands pointing at code. But hopefully that something in there made sense.
You're saying that like after line 20 to set a const of what the token input is and sanitize it there and then do the check, the if else. Is that right?
Maybe after line, I'm actually not paying attention super well to what 21 and 22 are doing, but definitely before line 24, right? So 24, 25, and 26 are all using your token input, and you probably would want to use the sanitized version in each of those cases. It just so happens that you are, because you already sanitized it when you were in the handle change function. So line 24, where you're calling sanitize, that value has actually already been sanitized, right, in the handle change. But if you were to move it out of handle change, you could put it in front of line 24, and then you would have it for both local storage and your set token state.
That makes more sense. Thank you.
I also wanted to say I love your placeholder. How 3-word token is 3 words and looks like a 3-word token. It's kind of made me smile.
Oh, cool.
I don't know if that was intentional, but
I wanted to chime in terms of like state management and deciding like with the on change and the submit, and just want to yes and to what Rob is saying. So when you have like React state, like the token input is controlled. So on the on change, you want to keep updating it to your app state. But the handle submit is you want to make sure what you're sending to the database would be clean. So you can kind of think of it in terms of like, what do I need to do before I save this? And that could be where you would sanitize, do your check, and then it's really good that now you're like, okay, I'm going to set it to local storage, and then I'm going to set it to my database. Does that help in terms of like thinking about organizing what you need to do?
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
Yeah, so breaking it down. So next time when you're working on something like this, where there's multiple things that need to happen, like start with one step at a time, like what needs to be done, and then go do it. So then it's like a very clear step as you're going through it, and you can kind of backtrack and find the bug.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. I think we just overdid it, but it's a easy fix. Yeah.
Yeah, it happens when you want to try many things once and then get confused, which is like, I still do that today. So the pairing and the extra eyes, it's always having someone ask you a question and you're like, oh, right, I shouldn't be doing 10 things at once. Let me start with the first pass. And what is that first pass?
Yep.
Cool. Well, good work, team, this week. And speaking of pairing and asking questions, our learning module this week is on pair programming. So you've been doing this for a little while, but I'm going to talk about it for a little bit, and then this will be maybe a little bit more interactive towards the end than some of the first two learning modules, because you've already been doing this. So I want to hear kind of your thoughts on what I talk about and how it's gone for you, and whether there's anything that I say maybe that is something you haven't done but you might try, or something you hadn't thought of, things like that. Okay, so pair programming, it is what we do at the Collab Lab. That's the goal, is to get that collaboration and that practice communicating. And so pair programming is one way to do that. A short definition here: two developers sitting together in front of a computer, taking turns writing code using just one keyboard. Just one keyboard. So this is kind of like the traditional pair programming, when you would go into an office and your company maybe there's like a culture of pair programming at your company, and so your workstations are maybe even set up this way so that you have pair workstations as opposed to like individual desks or something. And some people might use one keyboard. Another setup would be that you actually have two keyboards. Each person has their own, and that just makes it easier if you were wanting to, one person had an idea and they wanted to start doing something with it. You don't have to like pass the keyboard across the desk or things like that. So there are multiple configurations. You could even have two screens so that it's easier for both people to see. But the idea is that it's all of the actual work is happening on one computer. You're not going off and doing your own things. You're both looking at the same thing at the same time. And then there are two roles that naturally come out of this setup. So the terms for these are driver and navigator. I don't know how much you have read about pair programming or done it before the Collab Lab, and so you might not have even been using these terms, and that's fine. But the driver is basically the person typing, so currently typing. And this isn't like a permanent role on a team or even for a pair. It's just the person who is currently controlling the keyboard. They're writing the code to complete the task. This person will try to verbalize their thinking process as much as possible as they code. You're thinking low level about the code, meaning you're just like exactly the syntax and the things that you need to be typing onto the screen. The other role is the navigator. So because they aren't typing on the keyboard, they have a little bit more brain space to pay attention to other things. they're, watching the code that the driver is writing, maybe offering guidance or suggestions. They might be even just kind of like casually watching, but thinking about the next thing that is going to have to happen so that they're, kind of a step ahead and ready to think about that when the driver gets there. Acting as a sounding board, thinks with a bird's eye view of the code. So they're kind of like looking at the whole thing and being that extra pair of eyes that we've been talking about, thinking of, like the what if scenarios, like is that code going to work if the user types in a space, for example, or whatever. And thinking and just being that extra buddy. So the roles, again, they're not permanent roles. They don't have anything to do with experience even. It's not like you might think that the more experienced person should be writing the code and the less experienced person is watching and learning. Or you might think that the less experienced person is writing the code and the more experienced person is, giving guidance as they go. And in reality, both of those situations are valuable. And so when you have two people where one person has a lot more experience, that can be a very valuable pair setup. It's not that you should always be pairing with someone who is, exactly the same level as you all the time. You can pair with a senior person, or you can pair with a more junior person, and that really facilitates the knowledge sharing across the team, especially in an existing team where you're joining. You don't really know much about the current code base, but your partner does. That can be valuable. If they're the navigator, they can be kind of helping you as you go. But if they're the driver, you can kind of be seeing like, okay, this is, how their workflow goes. These are the keyboard shortcuts that I could really use to speed up my workflow, things like that. So there's and then these roles, the idea is that you can switch frequently. So the pace is really up to the pair. Some people would do something like a Pomodoro timer, and like maybe you pair or you drive for 25 minutes or something, and then you just switch. Or maybe you set a goal of getting this particular tiny piece of the task done, and then you'll switch, something like that. But we are remote, we're not in person. So we don't have the two keyboards or the single keyboard. So what does that workflow look like? Well, this is what you've basically already been doing. And this is a common scenario. You set up a screen share. The driver is the one sharing the screen and coding, navigator's watching. The navigator could even, have a Google tab open or something to be able to look things up on the fly, but mainly paying attention to the code and being that sounding board. The driver pushes code to the remote repo. This is when you actually want to switch your roles. In order to get that code on the other person's computer, you have to push it up somewhere. Navigator pulls that down, swap roles, and start over. And again, this cycle the time frame for this is basically however you want to set it up. An alternative to this with the screen sharing and pulling and pushing is a feature similar to, or either exactly Visual Studio Live Share or something like this, where instead of just looking at somebody's screen, you can actually set up an editor or an IDE to both be working in the same document. So here's a screenshot from their docs. You can see that one person's cursor is up here, the other person's cursor is down here. They have different tools that you can use. Like you can decide that you want to follow that person's cursor wherever it goes, and that'd be more like the screen sharing scenario. Or maybe you decide that for this, particular thing, there's enough of a reason to split up and quickly go do something else that you don't want to follow their cursor. You want to go kind of do your own thing. It'll be reflected on their system immediately as well. And this is cool because you don't really have to push and pull your code. You're just kind of both working on it at the same time. You can switch between driver and navigator as often as you want. it's more similar, I guess, to being in person with a keyboard at the same computer, because you can kind of just switch back and forth however you like. So the mindset and attitude going into pairing, it's an interesting workflow. It's definitely different from being solo. And there are some trade-offs that you make for the advantage that it brings you. So the advantage is you're sharing knowledge, you're working together, you're getting something done with like review as you go, as opposed to doing all of this work in isolation, sticking up a PR, and then having to wade through a lot of comments that might have been caught earlier on. So some of the things here, it says pairing is an exercise in sharing your Lego. They're basically, you may have written a piece of code that the driver is currently editing, right? You can't get too attached necessarily to your code. They might have a different way of thinking about things. It says, let's see, oh yeah, it can be more efficient to go with your pairing partner's idea than to argue on approach. So there are certain things that, and this is just kind of learning how the collaboration works, certain things that are more important to say, oh, we might not want to do that. And some things where either it's not important because the code is going to work either way and people can understand it, or it could be an opportunity to say, well, I'm pretty sure that that's not going to work, but we can try it, right? And if it doesn't work, then we've learned something. So that's where it's talking about here, the beginner's mind, embrace doubt and possibility. You can always try, you can always delete code, you can always replace code with something else. And having the opportunity as the driver to write something, see it fail and learn from that mistake, instead of always being told exactly what's going to be good and bad code, is valuable. So the second point there, not about teaching or mentorship. Again, these can be valuable parts to have if you're pairing with a senior developer and they have insights to give you, but primarily that's not the purpose of pair programming. And again, a good senior developer will not necessarily nitpick everything as you're typing. It's an opportunity to learn. Drivers, the posture should be to seek agreement with your navigator, and the posture of the navigator should be asking questions and not telling the driver what to do. I heard somebody else say they know that I think this is a previous cohort, they know that they're not doing their navigation correctly if they find themselves saying like the exact characters that they want the driver to type on the screen. I've found myself doing that before too. Like it's hard, sometimes code is hard to say in English, and so you might say like open parenthesis thing, close, but you want to allow the driver to be able to do as much of that as possible without feeding that to them. Okay, so this is the point where we're going to talk just briefly about what your thoughts are on this this presentation and how it compares with the experience you've had here at the Collab Lab, if you've had other experience, or yeah, if you've learned anything or found anything interesting.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
No, you can go.
Okay, I was just, when you were talking about the driver, I just wanted to say that I feel like Dana is like a really, really good driver. And I've been trying to be more like that, where she like is really good at speaking aloud exactly what she's doing. I noticed for me, like when I'm coding, and I like said it to like all my partners, like, I'm sorry, I know I'm mumbling. So I think that's something I've been trying to work on, is like when I'm on work mode, I'm just like, but yeah, I just want to say that Dana does like a really good job of saying like everything she's doing, which is really nice and helpful.
I skimmed over that really quickly, but yes, verbalizing what you're doing as you're doing it is super helpful for the navigator to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that. This is kind of the approach that we were taught in my boot camp. It's just like a driver navigator, and like how a driver like a typical a driver should be, and like how a typical navigator should be. Like they should take turns, and like I feel like I've in the past I found like the best way to do this is like you just kind of like ask the person like what they want to do in the first, like, do you want to be navigator or driver first, and then kind of like switch off for every feature. So everyone gets like a little chance to like, kind of do code. Because I feel like everyone likes to code. So like it's kind of good to like, take turns and everything. And yeah, sometimes like even when you're navigating, you can kind of still like throw in your style if like the driver is like willing to like take I guess feedback. So I feel like that's like when you have a good pair like that who like can build off each other, like I think it's really valuable. But I think a good point to like switch off is like features. I feel like they're like easy, like small features, and then you kind of like take turns. Because it's really easy to switch off when you're like just working in one branch.
Mhm. One thing you said there made me think, if the driver has arrived at like a piece of code that they don't feel very comfortable in, that could be another point that you just switch, right? You don't, even if they've only been going for 5 or 10 minutes, they're like, I would rather watch here and kind of see how you would do this, rather than, it can be, and this just depends on how you want to approach it, but it can be frustrating as a driver to have to keep asking the navigator questions in order to do your job as the driver. And so if you're just feeling like you're like trudging through this and it would be easier and you learn more watching, then that would be a great time to switch as well.
Yeah, for sure.
I like to say what I'm uncomfortable about, just so it's up front. Like, hey, this part looks like challenging to me. Like, can we switch here? Or do you know something about this? Like, how can we tackle it? I find that if I like communicate what's going on in my head, it's a lot easier for somebody else to work with me, to work together. That leads to a lot of over talking also, but the positive aspect is to at least know where somebody's coming from.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, with this last issue that Rafa and I were working on, they had like a totally different approach that I was thinking of. So I was like, go ahead, let me just see what you're gonna do, because I had no idea. So then that was nice to just like watch Rafa's approach and see it come together. So yeah, that's a good time to switch.
Very cool. Yenli, do you have any thoughts?
I do, but I'm wondering if Rafa want to share something before I get into my monologue, because I ramble.
Oh, not at all. Feel free.
So want to agree with everybody is saying, which is great. Like talking through as a driver, you're talking through the uncomfortableness. It helps you with interviews as well. There are potentially some companies would do pairing as part of the technical interview, especially if you are a beginner. They want to see how you communicate, how you like. As you're typing, you're talking like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that, and pretend that your interviewer is the navigator. Then you can, if you hit a hard part, you can ask them questions and have them help you. And when you approach it like that, you will come out of the interview feeling more confident and not as like stressed out. And then the whole part about like not knowing how to do something. I recently just had that this past week, as in I had a task that was to, or a feature that we miss a requirement. And in order to do it, it was in an area of the code base that is really complicated. And in Epic work, it is common that the tech leads will start out with the Epic, right? So they would build out the more complicated parts, and depending on certain things that come up, sometimes it gets to a good place, then they hand it to the next person, and then they go on and try to figure out another complex things, and I'm the person who wraps up. So then there is cases where you could get to a certain point where you're like, I have no idea what I'm typing here. So it's okay to like, it's best to express it, to say, hey, I don't know, or like, what do I do here? Like, if they have to talk you through every single bracket, comma thing, like at the end of the day, you're learning from the other person. It's like the context sharing to understand the code base, especially if things that's been building, like the complexity of it just keeps building and building to the point where, you know, I was in a room and the two leads came in and then we're like, we're not sure what this does. And then the person who wrote it go, yeah, I don't know either. And it was just so funny. And then we just all laughed about it. So then the other part that if we have time, I want to ask about, like, this team did a bit of a mobbing at the beginning of this week to solve like the merge conflicts and stuff. I wanted to hear how your thoughts on how it went. And how you like it.
I thought it went great, except that because of Rafa's schedule, they weren't able to be there. That would have been better, always. But I thought being able to work like all hands on deck, like let's get through this quickly instead of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It was a really effective approach, especially because some hairy things came up when we were trying to solve for that. And if we were like team versus team going back and forth, I don't know if we would have come out of it by Tuesday. Or come out of it successfully, let's say that.
Yeah, personally, I had a lot of fun, like all of us just like talking at each other with our different ideas. So I thought that was cool.
Anybody else have anything to add?
I mean, I agree with everything. I mean, it was like 3 people doing one thing, so it was like way faster. It was like we were on like speed drive. Yeah.
So one of the things that comes up sometimes when talking about paired programming is, isn't it slower in the end because you're taking 2 people to do one task instead of 2 people to do 2 tasks? And there's a lot written about this. I'm not going to like do a thing about it. But on this next slide, and we're going to share the slides as well. Sorry, not in focus. There's a bit written about pair programming. You can Google plenty more that's been written about it. And advocates of pair programming will swear that it's faster, and you guys have mentioned that as well. Because you don't end up, as I was saying earlier, you don't end up with a PR that gets posted that nobody has ever seen before, and they have to load all of that context into their head. So if you're doing code reviews at all, pairing is probably going to be about equivalent. Plus you get, I think it's probably a little bit better of a knowledge sharing model than trying to do that in a PR. So there are several things here. One thing I wanted to highlight is this one at the end, creating a commit with multiple authors. If you were using something like the live share from Visual Studio, then you might be switching back and forth, but all the code is still on one. Well, no, the code is on both of your computers, but one person has to do the commit, right? And you might feel weird saying that you wrote this or the other person wrote this, right? Git has the ability to mention everyone who worked on this particular chunk of code. And that can be a nice way to just shout out the other folks who worked on that. And that link goes into the details. Oh, this one also is interesting. I haven't read this, but I have heard this term, promiscuous pairing. And the idea here is not switching roles, which is another thing that you do, but switching your pairs. And this is what we're doing here at Collab Lab every week. Some people do it way more frequently, like they switch pairs every 90 minutes, I've heard in some cases. Like if you're in an office and you have people around and you can just kind of rotate desks and things like that. And you can imagine how much more quickly knowledge gets shared around the team if you're doing something like that. But it's an interesting idea. a little bit harder to do, I think, remotely. But yeah. Okay. I think that's the end of this. Again, I will share the slides, and so you'll have access to all of these links. Does anybody else have anything to add or ask? Okay, then I think it is up to Yinli.
Okay, so we're going to go over issues. The first one is, as a user, I want to see a welcoming prompt to add to my first item if my list is empty, to help me get oriented to how the app works. So right now, when you go to list view and you created a token, it's an empty page. I think this screen capture, it's more of just adding a message and then bringing a button or a link that brings you to the add item page. It's a very straightforward, simple task. That's 7. And then issue 8. So this one is a lot harder compared to 7. So as a user, I want to mark an item on my shopping list as purchased so the app can learn how often I buy different items. The acceptance criteria. User is able to tap a checkbox or a similar UI element to mark an item is in the list as purchased. Items should be shown as checked for 24 hours after the purchase is made, i.e. we assume the user does not need to buy the item again for at least 1 day. And the reason this acceptance criteria is here is to simplify the task. And I think in the past, participants have been confused by this items like, why can't I uncheck? What if I made a mistake? That is fair, that is true. It does bother me too. So I just want to make sure I say it out there for all you hear it. And the reason is it gets really complicated in the logic if you allow unchecking. So as a first pass, like if it bothers you and you want to uncheck it, you can work on that as an extra feature. But as a first pass, assume that you can't uncheck it and that people will not buy once they, like if you buy a gallon of milk today, do you really need a gallon of milk tomorrow? Try to think of it that way, unless you guzzle, but So this also changes, like you have to think about how you want to structure your data, especially if you plan to uncheck your box. And here is a wireframe on what it could look like. You can ignore the details and delete that. I think details, it's not in scope for this project. Delete, you will do it in future issues. So basically, this is what it would look like, just checking and checking. We're not doing the filter items yet. That's another task for future. Any questions about this one?
Just that we take you at your word. Like once you check it, it's okay, like to have that as like sort of a failure point. That's just the first, that's our first check mark that we're going to do. The first thing we have to solve for.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's easier to disable it. There is, so it says like you want to leave it checked for 24 hours. So the challenge is the next day you come back, that item should be unchecked. So you do need to use some time thing to uncheck that box. So like, if I come back in an hour and I look at my list, that item should still be checked. But if I come back tomorrow or 3 days later, that item is unchecked.
Some sort of function that runs that once we check the box, it stays checked for 24 hours.
Would a set timeout work in this? I only use set timeouts for like a minute max, but would a set timeout work if we like put in like a really long number?
Well, that's assuming your app keeps running. People will exit your website and
Ah.
come back. Then
Oh,
your
that's true. It's gonna
timeout would
break.
not work. Yeah.
Yeah, it would
So
break.
it's definitely fair to use a date library to help you with time. I think in the past, one team tried to do everything with the base date time JavaScript object, and it was like pretty difficult. So feel free to use any library that could help you calculate time and then check against it, and then check it or not check it based on that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to chime in and say that, like, regarding like the 24 hours thing here, these issues, as I've been seeing them and for the first time over the course of this cohort, are a great like model to use going into your job of how to break down work, because you often I will, or other people on my team or whoever will write up an issue that has these, grandiose ideas of what we want to do, right? And maybe that is where we actually get, but everything has to be done in steps. And if you don't break it down at the issue level, then you're likely to end up with a PR that is gigantic and nobody wants to review it, because you're trying to do everything all at once. And so, getting the smallest incremental improvements that you can make done at a time is a really valuable exercise, muscle to exercise in team collaboration.
I want to chime in to say that when you get, as you move on in your career, even in this cohort, as you get to the last 2 weeks, it gets to the point where you can create tickets yourself and break down tasks and decide how to work things, right? So those are things that, by looking at these issues, how you can model and do that for yourself. At jobs, sometimes you get, build this feature. And here's some mock-ups or wireframes. So how would you do it? Would you just build everything all at once? You want to be able to break things down and figure out what are the building blocks, what needs to be done. So those are things that we're exercising here. So especially the last 2 weeks when you're making the site pretty, because there are certain things like, say you want to come back at that time and be like, not being able to check that button bugs me like crazy. Now I want to do it. Now I want to uncheck it. So what happens when you uncheck it? What happens to the data model to support that? So there's a lot of complexity to think about for yourself. And especially if you wanted to like build this further to give it more features as like a practice. So these two issues are very uneven. One is very light and one is very heavy. So curious to which pair would like to work on this, whether you want to unofficially just mob on both issues together. That's also an idea. And it doesn't have to be, the whole mob has to be there to completely finish everything. So one example with how my team works at my day job is sometimes we would start something and then whoever just could not follow through would not, and whoever can just finish will finish it up. But it's like a team dynamic thing that you can communicate and decide depending on who's busy, who's sick. I started the super hard requirement thing that I had no clue and was sick. So then another person just picked up where I left off and started pushing to the same branch. So that kind of stuff can happen too.
Well, I'm definitely totally open to mobbing both of these issues with the entire group. I did talk to Dev before we started to sync that I will have a really busy week going forward for work. So if we're not doing mobbing, then I prefer to have number 7 for our pair, but either one.
Viviana, Dana, is that okay with you?
Yeah, I think that's fine. We can take number 8.
Okay, cool. I'll put that in later because I can't multitask.
I'm not mad at you, Viviana. I'm not mad at you.
Did you see my smile? I was like,
Yeah, I saw you looking like, what does she think about that? I'm just
Well, you know,
laughing.
one
Nobody wants
suggestion-
the hard one, but that's okay.
I'm glad you noticed my reaction.
I got you.
One suggestion is, you can do the individual pair, and if Viviana and Dana feel like, oh my God, this is way too much, you can tap in people to join you to help and do the work. So I want to make sure people understand that those are good dynamics to have. And
Okay.
like the job that you get, you want your team to give you that kind of support too.
Cool.
Yeah, I definitely want to join you guys if you guys are like struggling or anything, because I feel like I have one time this week. Yeah.
Nice,
Yeah,
that'd
you
be
can
fun.
join even
If
if
I'm
you're not
around,
struggling.
definitely happy.
Mhm.
Great.
Also have an idea for the time thing. I know a package because I used the one like before when I was creating a mobile app for like, it was like a kind of like a blog. We're creating a blog. So whenever someone like sends like a post, like there's like seconds when they post it and stuff. So maybe we could use that library
Okay, yeah,
long ago or something.
cool.
Very cool. Thank you.
Anything else?
Pizza party time.
There we go. Cool.
Awesome.
See y'all next week.
Yeah, have a good week.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
y'all.
Bye.